Some disclaimers before we begin. 1. There may be some background noise, specifically my brother shouting in the background. And 2. This is being recorded live, so expect some mistakes. Chapter 13. A call for help. Frank. I didn't sleep well that night despite being exhausted, having gotten only a few hours sleep the night before. I lay in my bed and stared at the ceiling, working the facts over and over in my mind, trying to find a way to make it all make sense. I like for things to make sense. An electrical fire. That was the official finding of the Bayport Police and Fire Departments regarding the restaurant we watched get blown away before our very eyes. The red arrow stenciled above the door being dismissed as graffiti. A teenage prank, Olaf had hissed at us, his expression practically begging us to argue with him. Which we couldn't, of course. Joe and I were caught in a major catch-22 here. Tell the police what we knew and why we knew it wasn't a coincidence, and we'd be admitting to do some real investigating, therefore breaking the deal. The Jadoob School for Behaviour Modification Therapy on Rock Island beckoned. But that meant accepting, or pretending to accept, the official explanation. The restaurant's owner, a mild-mannered guy named Paul Famusa, certainly seemed to accept it. He even admitted that he hadn't had the electrical systems inspected yet, thereby leaving him open to mishaps like this one. But really, let's be realistic for a second here. Bad wiring on weird electrical connections cause fires, sure. But explosions? Big and loud enough to blow half the roof off the place and clear the town? And there was the guy's face. Paul Famusa's, I mean. His expression was a combination of shell shock and resignation that I had seen only once before. On Neanderthal Bunyan, when we showed up at his house after the beating. Yeah, this whole scenario had Red Arrow written all over it. Exactly what or who was the Red Arrow? When Joe and I had talked briefly before we hit the hay, I reminded him that when Officer Olaf scoffed at the existence of the Red Arrow, calling it an urban legend, he'd referred to the Red Arrow as he. What if there was one person, some kind of criminal mastermind behind the strange events of the last few days? But we'd been too exhausted to discuss this new possibility. I sat up in bed and then climbed out, padding out of my room and down the hall to Joe's room. I pushed open his door to the sound of loud snoring. Seriously? I asked, flipping on Joe's desk lamp. Joe did not respond. He was curled up in the fetal position, hugging his comforter like a teddy bear. His mouth was open. A puddle of drool glistened on his pillow. "Joe!" I shouted, moving closer to the bed. He jumped like he'd gotten an electrical shock. Sputtering, he looked around and spotted me sitting on the end of his bed. "Wah?" he asked, leaning back against the headboard and wiping his mouth. "Wanted to discuss the case," I said. Joe stared at me, his expression going from confused to incredulous to... kind of murderous. I may have misjudged this one. But luckily, I guess, for me, we were interrupted by Britney Spears. "Hit me, baby, one more time." Joe jumped up and scrambled for his phone on his nightstand. Grabbing it, he clicked it on and held it to his ear. Hello? He scrunched up his eyebrows as he listened to whoever was on the other line. I was stumped. Who would call it this hour? Unless... Joe met my eyes. "Okay," he was saying. "Okay, Seth. I know. He'll meet you at your place." I heard squawking from the other line. Seth didn't seem to like that idea. Okay, Joe said, nodding. "Sure, I got it. The walls have ears." He paused. "Yeah, I know what you mean. Okay, see you there in 10. He clicked off the phone and turned to me, holding up one finger. "1, he said, "do not ever wake me up in the middle of the night to discuss a case." I was feeling a little sheepish, I must admit. "Understood," I said with a nod. "Sorry about that." Joe nodded. 2, he said, holding up his second finger. "We have to meet Seth Diller in the woods behind the football field. He wants to talk about the Red Arrow." Seth had sounded totally freaked out, Joe explained as we drove through the deserted streets of Bayport for the second time in 2 nights. He was afraid his house was bugged, his phone was bugged. That's why he wanted to meet in person. "Did something happen to him?" I asked, wondering what had prompted this sudden cry for help. "I don't think so, not yet," Joe said, pulling into the parking lot behind the football field. We got out and started following a narrow path through the woods toward a little clearing, maybe half a mile in. The clearing was a popular hangout for cases of all sorts of activities, not all of them legal. Joe and I had gotten to know it well during our investigative career. When we reached the clearing, we saw Seth sitting on a big rock that had been covered in graffiti as long as I had been alive. He looked nervous. "Hey, Seth," I said, nodding in greeting. "I'm glad you called. We want to try to help you." Seth stood. He still looked freaked. In fact, his eyes looked particularly buggy tonight. "Thanks, guys," he said. "I'm glad you showed up. I'm ready to talk about the Red Arrow." That was weird. "You don't have to shout it," Joe said. "The walls have ears, remember?" Suddenly a dark figure appeared out of the woods and tackled both Joe and me, pushing us to the ground. I wasn't able to brace myself with my hands, and I went down hard on my chest and had the wind knocked out of me. I struggled to get my bearings. This was a setup. I could hear the thud of fist hitting muscle as the attacker pummeled Joe, and Joe fought back. I pushed myself up and the wood spun. I could see Seth standing nervously behind our attacker, looking every bit like the weasel he was. "This is the thanks we get for trying to help you," I managed, still struggling to get my breath. But then I heard a buzzing sound and looked over at my brother and the attacker. He was wearing a David Letterman mask. And he had a taser. "No!" I shouted as I leaped forward, grabbing the thing out of his hand right before he applied the electrical current to my still struggling brother. That got the attacker's attention. He immediately turned to me, lunging to get the taser back, but he only succeeded in knocking it out of my hand. He threw his whole weight on me, pinning me to the ground. I used all my best self-defense training, Dad insisted back in the day, to get free, but this guy was all arms. I placed a few well-aimed punches, but at my odd angle I was able to land only a few. I could tell the guy was tiring out though. Maybe whoever sent him hadn't mentioned that there would be 2 victims. He crawled forward and I could tell he was going for the taser. But then Joe suddenly stood up behind him, the taser in his right hand. He was panting, still trying to catch his breath from his own struggle with this guy. Joe pressed the sides of the taser and the electrical current sizzled, bright blue white. "You want to tell us what the heck's going on?" he asked. "Or would you like to meet my friend Mr. Sparky?"